I think we can start now. Thank you, dear panelists, for joining us. I think I will pass the floor to Tetyana Filevska, the creative director at the Ukrainian Institute. Tetyana, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tetyana Filevska, as you already know, and I do work at the Ukrainian Institute, which is Ukraine's public institution affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And our main goal is to facilitate international connections between people and institution and to create cultural connections between Ukraine and the world. Together with the Birkbeck College, University of London, the Center for Museum Cultures, and the British Council, we are launching a series of discussions mapping Ukraine in the museum world collections and practices. These series consists of two events, which will focus on the place of Ukraine in the decolonization process of museum institutions. This event is part of the UK-Ukraine Season for Culture, which was designed and is being organized by the Ukrainian Institute and the British Council. Within this season, we are conducting dozens of different events that present Ukrainian culture in the UK and bring UK culture to Ukrainian audiences. We would like this event to pursue two main objectives. The first day will focus on the very issue of decolonization and its shift in meanings, especially on the context of the war in Ukraine. So that will be more of, let's say, theoretical discussion or something that's related to the discourse. And on the day two, we will talk about how the museum world, in the largest sense of this term, could support the effort to decolonize museums in the aftermath of the Russian invasion, and also about the challenges of Ukrainian museums that are connected with the ongoing Russian aggression, Russian war on Ukraine. These last 8 months, one of the main focuses of our activities was around decolonization. And we find it's extremely important to explain to the world why Russian aggression against Ukraine has a neo-colonial, neo-imperial character, why we need to deconstruct this language that Russia imposes on the world about Ukraine, and how this discourse, this toxic discourse, is rooted into international art institutions, in particular in museum practices and museum agendas. Before we continue and we go into the deeper conversation, and I'm fascinated to hear and excited to hear all the scheduled panelists, I would like to thank and invite our partners and colleagues who actually made this event possible, and I would like to ask them to also say a few words and introduce themselves. And I will just name all of them and then ask them to come in. So it's David Codling, the British Council's Global Arts Portfolio Advisor and Director of the Ukraine-UK Season at the British Council, which is kindly supporting this event. Stephanie Bowry, Director of the Center of Museum Cultures at Birkbeck. Anastasia Yevseyeva, my colleague at the Ukrainian Institute, who is head for visual culture. Katarzyna Murawska-Muthesius, Honorary Research Fellow of Birkbeck College, member of the Steering Committee of the Center for Museum Cultures. And I would like to express my gratitude to the speakers, including our major museum personalities from Ukraine, as well as universities from all over the world. And we are honored to have you with us. And I would like to thank all the guests attending this event, joining this discussion. And just a reminder that we are broadcasting on the Zoom platform, and as well you can see us on the Facebook page of the Ukrainian Institute at the moment. We will keep the record, so it will be archived on the website of all the partners of this event. It will be in English and both with the Ukrainian subtitles. So that is the introductory speech for me, and I would like to pass the mic, the floor, the screen now to David, if we have him with us. Then maybe we can have David a bit later, I really hope, and then I will ask Stephanie to join the conversation.
Thank you so much, Tetyana, for that wonderful welcome, and you have very good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone joining us from Ukraine tonight under what must be unimaginably difficult circumstances, and we all hope that you and your families are keeping safe and well. So my name is Stephanie. I'm a lecturer in museum cultures at Birkbeck, and I'm actually the co-director for the Centre of Museum Cultures with my colleague Anna Jameson, who's hoping to join us tomorrow night. And I'm really delighted to welcome such an international panel, and it's my honour to chair this first day of the discussions. So I'll keep my welcome really brief with just a few words about the event, how it's going to run, and some housekeeping. As Tetyana says, the event will be recording. These recordings will be available approximately 1 month after the event. The Ukrainian Institute are very kindly going to add captions for those who are deaf or hard of hearing, and subtitles in both English and Ukrainian. Tonight, we're going to be hearing 4 presentations of about 20 minutes each from colleagues in Ukraine, Poland, and the USA. And we will hear each presentation before coming together at the end of all the talks for questions and discussions. It's important to note that we don't actually have a scheduled break in the programme, so please feel free to just take breaks when you need to. Please remember to keep your mics muted if you're not speaking, just to help us avoid any problems with sound. And I would like to also say a special thank you to our colleagues and sponsors at the British Council, the Ukrainian Institute, and in particular, Kasia Murawska-Muthesius at Birkbeck and Anastasia Yevseyeva, who have put this fantastic programme together. And I will now pass over to David if we have him, but perhaps not if Kasia would like to speak.
So I think this is time for Anastasia, and I will be speaking at the end.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Birkbeck College for initiating this idea, and British Council for making this discussion and this event possible. I have to say that initially, when we were planning this event, we were planning it to be a smaller one. But when in our inner talks and discussions, we realized that this topic of the role of the museum in decolonial discourse is so wide that we need at least 2 days to only start this conversation and point out the main issues that we want to raise. It was very important for us to include both practical and academic approaches, and therefore I'm very happy and honored that we have representatives from Ukrainian museums, the Khanenko Museum in Kyiv, which suffered a lot from shelling recently, Territory of Terror in Lviv, Odessa Fine Arts Museum, as well as renowned representatives from international institutions, researchers and practitioners in the field of museology and decolonial studies. It is very important for us that you join us today in our discussion on decoloniality, on decolonial approaches to Ukrainian art, to approaching Ukrainian heritage, to rethinking the strategies and aims of decolonial project in terms and after Russian aggression in Ukraine and war in Ukraine. Thank you for being here with us, and I hope that you enjoy this discussion. Kasia, I will pass the floor to you, and since we are still waiting for Hanna Rudyk to join us, I suggest that Miroslava starts her presentation first, if you don't mind.
Yes, I just want to say a few words of introduction as well. And I cannot speak actually without PowerPoint presentation, so bear with me, and I will try to share my presentation with you. There are just a few slides, so don't worry, it won't be particularly, of course, that it doesn't appear on my screen, so wait a moment, I always have a problem with doing that.
Kasia, let me start your presentation for you, maybe.
Okay, so this is not my final version, but I don't know why I cannot share. So do start the presentation that you have, and then we will start from there. So I'm not going to repeat those things that have already been said. They are just those few points which have already been spelled out. Perhaps that Russian war on Ukraine was actually a trigger for us to learn much more about Ukraine and to understand the way, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, which was colonial in the past and is neo-colonial after 1991. And I want to say rethinking the aims of the decolonial project as a whole. And I think, it might mean many things, but it means also that the colonial project tended to focus on the West and its overseas colonies, skipping Russia as a colonizer and leaving the complex colonial matrix of power within Eastern Europe marginalized. So, so this is, and I have to say that I have to admit my own culpability here. But virtually all the papers deal with the issue of museums and their role in the decolonial project. So we have plenty of time over those 2 days to think about it. Now, could I have a next slide, please? Yes, so I love maps. So since the title of our event reads Mapping Ukraine in Museums, I want to use this opportunity to say a few words which arise from the issues arising in the process of mapping Ukraine, which is closely related to the way of representing Ukraine in museums. And I want to show just 4 maps which project the hugely complex history of today's Ukraine, its territorial origins, ancient origins as Kyiv and Rus, much older than Muscovy, which turned into Russia, and a long history of its colonization by foreign powers, and the term Ukraine being associated with a region rather than a sovereign entity. Most importantly, the maps reveal the diversity of Ukraine, which kept growing literally on the crossroads of many cultures and languages, coming from the north, east, west, and south, just like Europe. The first map on the left is from a contemporary history atlas, and this shows the rise of the Kievan Rus, which had been established. Excuse me, was there anything? Oh, that was just a, okay, which had been established by the Vikings in the 19th century. Oh, no, the previous map, please. The previous slide, please. Can we have the previous slide? I cannot see any way. Okay, I can see now. So, and one of the early rulers of Kievan Rus, Prince Volodymyr, adopted Christianity from Byzantium, turning Kyiv into a splendid center of power, which by the 13th century would cover a huge territory, as you can see on the map, spreading to the Baltic and further. And please note that Muscovy, I'm not sure whether you can see my pointer, that Muscovy, which should be here kind of northeast, is not there yet, has not been entered on the map because it arrived much later as an entity. Kyiv and Rus came to an end when it was first conquered by the Mongols in the 13th century, Golden Horde, and then overpowered by the Duchy of Lithuania and colonized by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is this large, wide blotch on the map on the right. And from the 16th century, Poland exploited the fertility of the Ukrainian soil, turning the lands into the granary of Europe, which continues until today. And then, well, it doesn't move when I'm moving. So could I have the next slide, please? Fantastic. So, and on the left, there is an old map by a German cartographer, acknowledges the reappearance of Ukraine as a sovereign land. It is named Ukraine and described as the Cossacks' land, as it gained independence from the Commonwealth due to the Cossacks' rebellion in 1648. At the same time, however, Ukraine was becoming politically dependent on Russia. And Russia grew out of the former Muscovy, becoming an empire which swallowed all its neighbors, as seen on the last map, Russia in Europe in the 19th century. So Ukraine disappeared again from the maps, together with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, both becoming just the regions of the Russian Empire, gubernias. As it happened, the 19th century was the age of the establishment of museums and art academies, of the formation of the art world. The invisibility of Ukraine as a sovereign land, to a large extent, was to be mirrored by the invisibility of Ukrainian art, roundly absorbed by Russian art. Could I have the next slide, please? The contemporary map of Ukraine emerged throughout the numerous revolts of the 20th century, which led to the establishment of an independent state, of the independent state of Ukraine in 1991. Putin's Russia kept invading it since 2014, questioning its sovereignty and attempting to colonize it again. The symposium gives us a chance to learn about the ways in which the Ukrainian museums today take part in the current war efforts, but also to think about the ways in which the museum world outside should recognize the existence of the Ukrainian art and culture as separate from Russia. And please note here, looking at this map, which puts Ukraine into focus, and therefore I have chosen it from many other contemporary maps of Ukraine, that the name Kyiv is misspelled as Kiev, as the Russian kind of form of this name. So it actually, whereas other names of cities such as Lviv or Kryvyi Rih are spelled properly. So it just shows that the process has started, but there is still a lot to be done, both in terms of mapping and naming the territory of Ukraine, as well as mapping and reclaiming Ukrainian history, culture, and art in museums. So I would like, before we move to our, so that was the end of my introduction, and which was actually addressed less to the Ukrainian attendees, but more to British and other students who might not know the issues arising with mapping and actually history of Ukraine as a sovereign nation and state. So, but before we move to our speaker, let me introduce our chair for today, Stephanie Bowry. Stephanie, you have introduced yourself beautifully. You've already said many things, so I'm not going to repeat what you have said, but I'm going to read out some interesting aspects of your research. So Stephanie is a historian of museum practice, specializing in display methods and the construction of knowledge in museums, just very rightly for our symposium today, but also galleries and gardens in the 16th and 17th century. And prior to joining Birkbeck as a lecturer in 2022, that is this year, she was a teaching fellow and Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the School of Museum Studies, University of Leicester, and a visiting lecturer at the University of Cambridge and the University of Iceland. She has worked and volunteered in a number of UK museums and heritage sites, including the Royal Collections and the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And she's now working on turning her postdoctoral research on the relationship between art galleries and gardens into a book. Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Kasia, and thank you for providing that very clear historical context. And I like the sort of the literal mapping exercise. I think it's very interesting to look at maps as these really sort of, biased forms of knowledge construction as well. So that was incredibly helpful. So may I just ask Anastasia and Kasia if we would still like to start with Miroslava?
We have Hanna Rudyk with us, so we can start as planned. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, that's wonderful. So what I will do then is I will just introduce Hanna, and we can get started with our first presentation. So just bear with me one moment. So just say a few words about Hanna. Hanna Rudyk, PhD, is a Deputy Director General in charge of Education and Communication and a Curator of Islamic Art at the Bohdan and Varvara Khanenko National Museum of Arts in Kyiv, Ukraine. Her curatorial contribution since 2002 has included the development of the recent permanent exhibition of Islamic art in 2006, as well as numerous research, curatorial and publication projects on Islamic and Asian art, the history of the Khanenko Museum and its founders. In 2005 to 2007, she coordinated the Matra Museums of Ukraine international grant project on museum management and education. As Deputy Director in charge of education since 2011, Dr. Rudyk initiated and coordinated the first museum visitors survey in 2013 that fed into the development of the new Khanenko Museum outreach programming strategy, addressed to various audiences, including people with disabilities and other socially vulnerable communities. Dr. Rudyk's professional interests include the history and museology of Islamic art, coloniality and decolonisation of culture and museums, the history of the Khanenko family and the Khanenko Museum, innovation in museum education, inclusion and participation. The Russian war in Ukraine has prompted her new research project on the experience of decolonising museums of non-European and primarily Islamic and Asian art in Europe, which has been funded through grants from the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation and Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And the title of Hanna's talk today is Ukrainian Hybrid Orientalism and the Paradox of Decolonial Disposition. Thank you very much and a warm welcome to you, Hanna.
Hello, thank you very much, Stephanie, for your kindest introduction. Thank you for inviting me into this conversation. As Professor Katarzyna Murawska-Muthesius has stated, the war has powerfully stimulated the decolonial agenda in Ukraine. It made obvious the reality and scale of Russia's neo-imperialist ambitions. The very word decolonization has gained significant public use both in professional and in wider public context. In both of them, it seems to become rather a louder substitute for the more familiar notions of de-Russification, decommunization, Sovietization, generally meaning resistance to the diverse phenomena of today's Ukrainian culture caused by the centuries-old history of colonial or quasi-colonial dependence of Ukraine on Russian domination, from the era of the Russian Empire through the period of the Soviet Empire and further on to this post-Soviet period. This site-specific reading of decolonization is quite understandable given the condition of war. However, decolonization has a global history and a global context. Timothy Snyder, and here I would like to ask Nastya to switch to the first slide. actually to the third one, Nastya, right to the third one. Yeah, yes. Timothy Snyder, a leading historian of Ukraine, who was one of the first to argue for a neo-colonial nature of Russian military aggression, noted that, quote, when Vladimir Putin denies the reality of the Ukrainian state, he is speaking the familiar language of empire. For 500 years, European conquerors called the societies that they encountered tribes, treating them as incapable of governing themselves, end quote. For Snyder, Ukrainian experience fits well into the global process of decolonization, generally aimed at resisting the system of values and practices based on the idea of a perceived superiority of one human community over another, that, the idea, legitimates injustice, exploitation, and violence. This system of values and practices was shaped in the culture of Western European modernity in the heart of its Renaissance worldview. Rationalized and institutionalized in the Age of Enlightenment and on, it became a universal epistemic matrix which supported and promoted historical colonialisms of Western superpowers over mostly non-European cultures and communities. The central idea of this episteme was defined by Nelson Maldonado Torres, a Puerto Rican decolonial thinker, as a metaphysical catastrophe of splitting the very concept of humanity into a full humanity of some people and a sub-humanity of others. The same epistemic matrix laid the foundation of the very idea of a museum. I'm convinced that conversation on decolonizing Ukrainian museums would gain more meaning, more relevancy, and productivity if contextualized within this global history of colonialism and coloniality, deeply rooted in the culture of Western modernity. Due to its historical geography of the frontier of civilizations, the border space between Europe and Asia, Ukraine has a complex and very specific coloniality. From the 16th to the 20th century, different parts of Ukraine were internal, political, and cultural colonies within bigger Eastern European polities like Rzeczpospolita, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Soviet Union, all of them themselves fundamentally dependent upon Western knowledge, politics, and culture. Ukraine took European culture as a model long before Russian dominance, and it continued following Europe in the colonial period through the mediation of the dominant Polish, Russian, and Soviet cultures. From the late 1980s and much more after the collapse of the USSR, Ukrainian culture, science, and education, and in particular museums, opened themselves up to Western knowledge, which flowed in a chaotic stream promising development and modernization. The museums eagerly perceived and applied this knowledge, often uncritically, outside their own reflected subjectivity and cultural context. Particularly evident, this uncritical adoption of the Western patriarchal, Christian, and white discourses based on dichotomies reflecting colonialist hierarchies of cultures was in the museums of other art. The discourse that Anwar Said defined in his seminal 1978 book as Orientalism, and which he described as an effective epistemic tool for setting power and legitimizing violence of a Western colonizer over a non-Western colonized. Most Ukrainian museums, and I would dare to suppose that as well as schools and universities, either do not tell the history of the most non-Christian and non-white cultures, or they uncritically tell their history composed by white, Christian, Western, or Russian men. And museums that keep collections representing these cultures serve both a manifestation and an effective instrument of this deeply internalized second-hand Orientalism of Ukrainian culture. Let us take the Kapala, one of the central objects of the recent Buddhist permanent collection of the Khanenko Museum, the museum holding the most important world art collection in Ukraine. Our highlight, the Kapala, is a ritual bowl for offering, made from a human skull in the 18th century in Tibet, today politically subjected to China. The bowl carries rich symbolism, reflected in its elaborate embellishments of gilt bronze and semi-precious stones. Both symbolic and aesthetic aspects of the object were studied by the museum and were retold to the museum visitors in more or less detail with emphasis on the artistic side. But almost nothing had been known and told on the provenance of this remarkable piece, except the very fact that the ball was donated to the museum in 2000 by a private Ukrainian collector who bought it in Europe. No more details. The former owner of the piece could just tell nothing, as this information was just not important to be collected and preserved. So all people intimately connected with the object, starting with the owner of the skull, her or himself, to the craftsman who turned the skull into a bowl, and the lama who consecrated it and used it in the ritual. All these and other people for whom Kapala was a particularly culturally meaningful, a sacred object, were not important. Instead, always important were Russian and Soviet researchers of Central Asia, exclusively male civilizers of the savage people, whose stories of finding and donating objects the museum cherished as a due of memory and gratefulness. And we, the museum curators, were also more important as long as we granted ourselves the right to go on silencing people of origin and excluding them from the history. The colonial difference is obvious here in this pronounced inequality of humanity. The museum dehumanized some people, their lives and their cultures, the way Western and Russian colonialist scholarship and museology taught it to do. This second-hand orientalism of Ukrainian science and culture, widespread and systematic, makes a hybrid, multi-layered combination with Ukrainian colonial wound of a subaltern culture, doubly orientalized by the West, regarding it as subjected periphery of Russia, and by Russia itself, an oriental periphery of the West. The Khanenko Museum has a list of valuable artifacts, including unique Islamic pieces that were forcefully transferred to the State Hermitage Museum in the 1930s. And it was until the last decades that the Hermitage scholars, who had always had much wider access to Western knowledge, used to come to Kyiv to disseminate it and test it on our collections. So being doubly orientalized, Ukrainian museum culture has been actively promulgating Orientalist narratives of both its metropolises, Western and Russian. Please switch to the next slide. An example of the latter was the introduction of the Soviet East concept. In 1930, the museum scholar Maria Vesmitina was made to urgently reconsider the first permanent display of Islamic collection and to divide it into two separate parts: medieval empires of Turkey and Persia and the Soviet East, that in fact consisted of former Russian colonies in Turkestan and Caucasus. This totally artificial separation of the collections dating from the 8th century on was preserved in the museum exhibitions throughout the whole 20th century and until very recently. The systematic hybrid Orientalism of Ukrainian museums and of Ukrainian culture in general is safeguarded by a glaring void of knowledge of Ukrainians in the global history of colonialism and decolonization. A Ukrainian subject of thinking generally lacks a global context of self-comprehension and self-projecting. Russia has largely locked Ukraine epistemologically on itself, on discussion with itself, on struggle against itself. This is one of the efficient tools of Russian and any other imperialism and colonialism. For most of us, neutral lessons on classical Russian literature outside the context of Russian imperialism has become totally impossible, at least this year, and this has been reflected already in the school programs. Similarly impossible for an increasing number of world museums are today innocent projects on the history of the Spanish Golden Age or the traditional art of African cultures, presented outside the context of colonization and colonialism. We need to join this club, acknowledging Russian and Soviet colonialisms as variations of a global phenomenon. We need to clearly realize that the shockingly inhumane atrocities of Russians in Bucha, Olenivka, or Izium have a background enormous in its scale and horror in the First and Second Chechen Wars, the Nazi genocide of Jews in Roma, the pacification of Algeria by the French, the German genocide in Southwest Africa, the subjugation of indigenous peoples of both Americas, Siberia, the Far East, and so on, everywhere where colonialism has reached and where the catastrophic split of humanity was implemented through murder, rape, deprivation, deportation, exploitation, etc. To overlook this global scene of Russian violence is irrelevant and counterproductive for our resisting it, as well as it is unjust and non-solidary for the memory of many people. Fighting for our own liberation, aren't we to support others in their pursuit of freedom? I see this cognitive and discursive connection to global context very timely. It is not about abrupt change of the public discourse towards a West critical rhetoric. Still less needed are any actions that might play into Dugin's and Tramblin's manipulative rhetoric of decolonization. Instead, I'm calling for Ukrainian curators, educators, teachers, researchers, and journalists to make an intellectual and willful effort to expand and upgrade their knowledge on the global history of colonialism and coloniality and introduce it into professional agendas. It can release a great emotional energy of solidarity and give us access to the richness of world experience of decolonization. And now, when the collections of Crimean museums are being looted and taken to Russia, our job is to learn from those countries and communities that are successfully returning their heritage today from the displacement, from the places of their displacement. Also, it will bring us more closely to the contemporary reflexive West, which in contrast to Putin's Russia, seeks and finds way to decolonize itself along the lines of race, religion, gender, nature, etc. After all, isn't it rather this very West that actively supports Ukraine in the war today, pointing to Russia as speaking the familiar language of empire? I'm convinced that only on the global dynamic map of decoloniality, Ukraine can reflect its unique experience and work out its own cognitive, cultural, and political trajectory of decolonization. How can museums practically decolonize themselves? Since one of our speakers today is Professor Magdalena Wróblewska, co-author of the absolutely fascinating last year book, Practicing Decoloniality in Museums, I'm not even trying to give an exhaustive answer on this question, but I will only touch upon certain aspects I consider essential. Maldonado Torres noted in his 10th thesis on colonialism and decoloniality in 2016 that decoloniality is about production of, quote, counter-discourses, counter-knowledge, and counter-practices, which are aimed at the dismantling of colonialism and the discovery of a multitude of other forms of being in the world, end quote. Peruvian Aníbal Quijano and Argentinian Walter Mignolo, both classics of decolonial thinking, called this cognitive tool correspondingly the decolonial delinking and the decolonial disobedience, the terms meaning a type of thinking that singles out, undermines, and subverts the colonial norm as a natural order of being, perceiving, thinking, speaking, relating, and acting. Decolonial thinking is constantly aimed at the discovery and overthrowing of, using the term of the Colombian thinker Santiago Gaston Gomez, quote, hubris of the starting point, end of quote. The centering point of cognition, which in the context of coloniality is always located elsewhere, outside the experience of a colonized, but which is perceived by a colonized as ontological. Decolonial thinking transfers this ontology into epistemology, visualizing the cognitive colonial frame. This allows a subject of thinking to recenter the comprehension and to construct his, her, their, or its own narrative. Thus, decolonial thinking has no permanent themes, no fixed semantic topoi. It is atopic, mobile, not just due to the mobility of knowledge per se, but because of its defining vector towards disbalancing, shifting, and subverting norm. Since thinking as a skill is a necessary but not sufficient condition for thinking as a process, I apply in my research the concept of a thinking disposition as an active readiness to engage into a certain type of thinking, the concept that has been worked out by Project Zero of Harvard Graduate School of Education. Please switch to the next slide. Despite its etymology associated with ordering something or setting something in order, A decolonial thinking disposition is a disposition aimed not to set in order, but to continuously discern existing order to subvert it, in order to subvert it. Its key feature is a constant motion of a subject of thinking in search of a new analytical distance that will make this order sensible. And as a constant motion, decolonial disposition is a very resource-consuming mode. To use Harvard model, please switch to the next slide. Decolonial thinking disposition thus includes three key components: a skill of decolonial counter-thinking itself, a subject's motivation for it, and a subject's decolonial sensitivity. That is the ability to recognize situations where and when decolonial thinking is appropriate and required. Motivation for decolonial thinking can be built upon the above discussed wider knowledge in the world history of colonialism and decolonization. Both the global and the local history frameworks should find their place. This knowledge will help to answer the question if and how coloniality touches me personally as a subject. It will also help to see the points where the logic of Russian aggression violence in Ukraine, the logic of fundamentalist attacks on women and homosexuals in many parts of this world, and the anthropocentric logic of contemporary world economy, science, and technology meet together. This knowledge will encourage a subject to develop a personal, ethical stance, which makes up a core of decolonial motivation. In this regard, decolonization is fundamentally a grassroots movement, the prime mover of which is the individual. Thus, decolonial disposition of a museum shapes as the personal decolonial motivations of its team members develop. An efficient tool of the museum decolonizing is a narrator's self-reflection, undermining the universality of traditional discourse, decentering it and recentering it in one's own experience of existence, let it be Ukrainian, post-Soviet, post-colonial, female, Buddhist, etc. Self-reflection feeds the agency of a subject, being it a person, an institution, or a society. Museum decolonization starts with its reflexive self-clarification, which makes visible traditional mechanism of its epistemic power. Reflection and clarification stimulate and refine the decolonial sensitivity, this third component of decolonial disposition of both museum professionals and museum visitors. The decolonial disposition could seem to make a museum vulnerable. New themes exposed for open public discussion could meet resistance both internally and externally, attracting criticism. One of the new soft mechanisms of sustainability is participation, built on an empathetic, loving listening to other voices, previously marginalized and silenced by a solid tradition. Both historical and contemporary voices. A museum should look for these voices and invite them to speak on its platform, to co-shape together with them its agenda, and thus to self-undermine the traditional exclusivity of its expertise in and its copyright over interpretation. Particularly important for museums of other cultures are voices of the people who represent the communities of origins of the collections. Another voice with a truly limitless decolonial capacity is of contemporary art. International exchange is also very productive. It is encouraging to observe how decolonial ethos is increasingly permeating the global museumscape, to see how curators and institutions share the power with new actors and operate new vulnerability. Ukrainian hybrid colonialism resonates with the traumas of both the former colonized and the former colonizers. And observing others, we can discern more signs of coloniality in ourselves. At the same time, borrowing someone else's bicycle to counter this progressivist adage will not work here. As said, the colonial disposition is a constant motion mode and is a very resource-consuming option because automatism saves energy. We can no longer rest on the tradition of our knowledge in every sense of the word rest. Why can museums save energy for constant de-automatization of their discourse and activity? If decolonizing is a long-term, entrepreneurs, so that we are able to, quote, inspire hope and healing, improve life, and better the world, end quote. The tasks that are increasingly seen by museums as primary. These are all very vital questions of today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Hanna. That was really fascinating. I thought it was very interesting what you were saying about secondhand orientalism and the need for sort of analytical when you're constructing in sort of any museum setting when you're setting out an argument, I suppose. I'm sure that lots of us will have questions for Hanna. As I say, if you can make a note of them and we'll save them to the end for our discussion, that would be fantastic. But for now, I'd just like to thank Hanna very much for her presentation.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So now we are going to go on to our second speaker. And I will just give a short introduction. So our next speaker is Magdalena Wróblewska. She is assistant professor at the Faculty of Artes Liberales, University of Warsaw. In 2015 to 2020, she was responsible for research activities in the Museum of Warsaw, where she co-curated the new main exhibition, The Things of Warsaw, in 2017. She has received several fellowships, including the Lieven-Gewert Center for Photography, the Katholische Universität Leuven in 2010, the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, the Max Planck Institute, and Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, 2012 to 2014, the Ruskin Library at Lancaster University in 2014, and the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, 2015. Awarded with a research grant by the National Science Centre in Poland in 2012, as well as the prize of the Polish Art Historians Association for her PhD dissertation in 2014. In 2018 to 21, she has been an investigator in a research project entitled European Colonial Heritage Modalities in Entangled Cities as part of Horizon 2020. And she's been working in a work package about museums' colonial pasts. Her recent publications are also on the subject of museums and decolonisation, and they include Practicing Decoloniality in Museums, a guide with global examples with Cizela Arize, published in 2021, and also The Duality of Decolonising, Artists' Memory Activism in Warsaw with L. Bukiewicz and J. Wenzarnik, also published in 2021. Her presentation today is entitled Decolonial Approaches in CEE Museum Cultures, Challenges and Perspectives. So I'm very delighted to welcome Professor Wróblewska to give her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me for this important discussion here today. Nastya, I would like to ask you for starting my presentation, my PowerPoint. I will not talk today about Ukraine specifically, although I will refer in my presentation to the situation of Ukraine today and the historic situation as well. Several times. I will speak about the general problems connected with decoloniality, decolonial practices in Central and Eastern Europe museums. And I will start with the simple observation that decolonial discourse is still focused mostly on Western post-imperial states like Great Britain, France, or Portugal, and of course on American region, mostly United States. And there has been significant gap concerning the region of Central Eastern Europe, its ambiguous status regarding the colonial past, and the colonial past that significantly differ from the Western models of colonialism. Countries like Poland, Hungary, or Czech Republic were for long not taken into account simply because they had no overseas colonies and were not directly involved in the 19th century colonial expansion. This so-called colonial innocence was questioned recently by researchers like Jan Sowa in case of Poland, including its relations with Ukraine, Zoltan Ginelli working on Hungary, and most recently Matthew Rampley who wrote on Czech Republic. I recall these authors, of course, among others, who were challenging this concept of colonial innocence of Central Eastern European states. Possible colonial entanglements of this region are being now discovered and critically analyzed. So the complex and multi-dimensional image of this part of history emerges. And what is significant for many of CEE countries is the ambivalent colonial status, which means being at the same time passive object and active subject in these subjugation processes. To emphasize these differences and address the complicated image, John Oldfield introduced the notion of multiple colonialism. Next slide, please. He made a clear distinction between colonialism and imperialism, two terms that are often confused or used interchangeably, but in his opinion have different meanings, both of special importance for Central Eastern Europe region. He claims that imperialism describes the way one country exercises domination over another and involves domination, but of a kind that is best understood as political or territorial. Colonialism, on the other hand, is usually associated with practices of domination that involve the subjugation of one group of people by another. It implies the transfer of people from metropole to colony, the compact settlement of overseas territories by outsiders, usually white Europeans, who create new societies while still maintaining political allegiance to their country of origin. For this reason, debates around colonialism invariably depend on a number of key binaries, among them colonizer versus colonized, civilization versus barbarism, universalism versus inequality. Oldfield indicates two key drivers of colonialism: the demand for new territory, and linked to this, the demand for natural resources. He takes into consideration broad historical perspectives, as we can trace the same underlying principles in the expansionism of the late 19th century, when the term colonialism actually came into vogue back in the ancient times. They are also implicit in Central Eastern European history. Oldfield states that Eastern Europe can properly be considered a zone of multiple colonialism, torn between great land empires in the 19th century. It was subjugated to the Nazi and Soviet totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. Racism, slave labor, internment, and warfare caused millions of deaths in this European bloodlands, as he called this area, as well as massive dislocations, of course. So the history of post-Soviet Russia has also been characterized by ruthless and premeditated incursions into neighboring countries, as witnessed what has happened in the Ukraine and Georgia. And this history, unfortunately, continues. The Russian invasion in Ukraine that we are witnessing at the moment and experiencing also, at least some of us, was rightly named the Colonial War by Timothy Snyder. So this is why the discussion that we can have here today is so urgent, but also so relevant and important. Oldfield recalls in this context of multiple colonialism also the Nazi concept of Lebensraum, which in the eyes of some critics, among them Sven Lindqvist, self-consciously mimicked older European notions of colonialism. Also, David Farber stated that the Nazi occupation of Poland was colonialism that can be analyzed as such without equating it with the more familiar cases. The idea that colonialism is not necessarily associated with possession of overseas territories and the politics towards them was further explored by the German historian Jürgen Zimmerer, who introduced the concept of European internal colonization. Can I have the next slide, please, for Jürgen Zimmerer's book? By describing the colonial practices within the European continent, focusing mostly, of course, on German example, Zimmerer challenged the very idea of colonialism that has been in the history, but also in post-colonial studies, associated mostly with the European overseas empires. Zimmerer and Oldfield both emphasized also the importance of racism in the internal European colonialism. Colonialism depended on notions of othering that assumed that indigenous peoples were inferior, backward, and in most cases disposable. Skin color was also an important register here, but so too were physical characteristics, customs and traditions, and also religions or confessions. So racism, violence, and brutality were justified here within racial theories that were developed also in CEE countries. There has been an extensive research on anti-Semitism in the region pursued in last few decades, but recently the focus is on less known issues, less known problems like racism directed toward people of African descent or Roma people in this region. They addressed in the newly published book by Agnieszka Kościańska and Michał Petryk titled Go Away on Polish Racism. Can I have a next slide, please? Authors here recall, among many examples from the late 19th century until nowadays, the incident called Mława pogrom that took place in 1991. That was ethnic conflict and eruption of nationalism directed against Roma minority in the small Polish city. Fortunately, nobody suffered injuries during this Mława pogrom, as most of Roma people have managed to escape the city, while few of them were hidden by some citizens, but their property was destroyed, and there was, of course, a huge shock, not only in this local community of Mława, but it was largely discussed in national newspapers, as it was only 2 years after 1989 when everybody lived with the hope for the justice and democracy and the values such as solidarity, of course. And this incident proved that serious unresolved issues and resentments were hidden beneath this new democratic discourse. So having in mind all these components of colonialism and imperialism, I would like to speak briefly about the mentioned dual status of CEE countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, among others, in the colonial history of this region. All these countries were at some point of the history victims, but also on the other hand, they played active roles, were agents in both local and global processes of colonization, with clear colonial ambitions and attempts at different stages of their histories. So Bogusław Bakua reflected on the problem of Polish-Ukrainian relations in early modern era in terms of colonial subjugation, but also on these stereotypes that are still present in so-called Polish borderland studies. There's also unwritten history of Polish and other CEE countries' colonial dreams about the overseas territories, mostly in Africa, with many harmful stereotypes about African peoples and cultures that were supported by ethnography and other disciplines of knowledge at the time. The image of Polish society emerging from these recent post-colonial studies is complex. It was imitating the colonial practices of Western empires, but at the same time, it was internalizing the orientalizing gaze of the West. It was being subjugated to Russian and German military supremacies, but tending to transfer also its inferiority complex to the lower strata or other ethnicities, mostly Jewish people, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Roma people as well. So this duality in the position of CEE non-imperial countries that were not only victims but also not only passive objects but also active subjects in these subjugation processes is, in my opinion, well visible in case of museums, where many patterns and stereotypes of defining and perceiving the other, the exotic and folk cultures were transferred from the Western ethnography and from the model of imperial museum institutions, supplemented with the local context, of course, like the representation of the mentioned mentioned ethnic minorities. So I would claim that it is precisely because of the persistence of this colonial innocence myth that all these stereotypes are reproduced in so many museums, especially the ethnographic ones, but not only, in CEE regions. So despite so many clear differences between Western and Central Eastern European countries in colonial processes and histories are visible, in case of museums, many problems remain similar or basically the same. This observation was included in the book that Hanna kindly mentioned in her presentation. Can I have a next slide? The book that I co-authored with Cilla Ariese, as the result of the ECHOS project, where I was involved in the work package analyzing city museums and their colonial pasts. The book was designed as a kind of guide for museum practitioners, but also for the wider audience. And it is presenting the colonial practices and approaches in ethnographic, historic art, and any other kinds of museums, with examples from different regions and historical contexts. So my co-author Cilla Ariese and me, we have decided to include the examples from the Central and Eastern Europe, like Poland and Hungary, as during ECHOS project, new knowledge about the colonial entanglements of this region was collected, and analyzing different examples, we have realized that there are some general problems regarding the colonization of museums that intersect multiple local contexts and different colonial pasts. So I would like to indicate two general issues that can be related to these decolonial processes globally and are relevant in case of CEE museums. The first one problem is related to objects that are connected to the widely discussed problems of restitutions, but also it's a problem of the meanings of the objects, their primary functions, ethical dimensions when we speak about human remains, religious and taboo objects in collections. We had actually example of these multiple meanings in Hanna's presentations. We have to remember that discussion about the ethic dimensions of collections, their sources, also is relevant in case of CEE museums too, that this is not only the problem of the Western empire's collections. So the other issue that I would like to mention is related to exhibitions, publications, and education in general. The problem of narratives or contents that museums are producing and disseminating that might be dangerous as they affect the perception and understandings of people and cultures represented by museums. There are many challenges that museums in CEE are facing on their way to decolonization, and they depend on local contexts and histories, but I would like to name a few of them that again seem more general and can be related to the whole region. The first and the most difficult would be the recognition and acknowledgement of own colonial past as a part of heritage that should be addressed in the public discourse. This is like the first step in this process of decolonization of museums in this region. The second would be defining the specificity of colonialism in Central Eastern Europe and in different states and different historical contexts. And the third would be to pursue research and build on this research in the museum practices. Like, by this research, I mean the general research on colonial pasts that would be the extensive research in the field of the history of the museum. And here it's like a big space for this kind of research. Not much was done in case of museum studies in CEE region. There is also the problem of research on museums' problematic pasts, different agents or actors on the history stage, like politicians, museums directors, curators, artists, but also travelers and collectors who are possibly bringing objects and donating them to the museums. And there is also a complicated research on object trajectories and provenances. They are different than in case of Western collections, but also very, very problematic. So these are these general problems and ideas, but I would like to now switch to a meaningful example, a case study, the example that I have actually seen only a couple of days ago, and I thought it would somehow fit into this presentation. So I would move to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, this is about the project. So, so the next, if I can have the book again. And select the, oh, here is the slide. So this is the example of the Re-Enchanting the World project by Małgorzata Mirga-Tas, the Polish Roma artist, for the Polish pavilion at the 59th International Art Exhibition in Venice Biennale. This exhibition, curated by Wojciech Szymański and Joanna Warsza, is an attempt to expand the Polish and European iconsphere and art history with representations of Roma culture, which is often overlooked and marginalized in official state discourses in CEE region. The artist draws from images of key importance for European art history and visual culture, appropriating them and inscribing in them a Polish Roma identity and vernacular historical experience. The interior of the Polish pavilion, can I have a next slide? This interior is covered with floor-to-ceiling hand-stitched tapestry panels divided into 3 horizontal sections. In the center, there are displayed 12 panels covered with depictions of 12 months of the year in large format textiles, which draw from the Renaissance astrological frescoes from the famous Hall of the Months in Palazzo Schifanoia in Ferrara. Can I have the next image? The symbols, this is Ferrara in comparison with the interior of the Polish pavilion. The symbols of the palace include zodiac signs. Can I have the next one? The zodiac signs, the decan system, the time cycles, and the migration of images across time and continents stand as visual and ideological points of reference, which the artist inscribes in the Polish Roma identity, adding portraits of important women in her life and representatives of Roma community. She creates an archive of Roma history built from a female perspective and recalls the vernacular historical experience. The upper section depicts the history of Romani peregrinations across Europe. The next slide, please, referencing the engravings of Lorraine printmaker Jacques Callot. Created in the 17th century, these engravings are full of anti-Roma stereotypes that were repeated constantly ever after in European cultures. The artist disenchants the painful narrative and draws on historical works to create her own large-scale collages, showing the rich world of the Romani past and mythology. The lower section consists of 12 paintings depicting contemporary everyday life in artist's home in Poland, in village Czarna Góra. Can I have the next slide? And in the areas which she's most closely connected to, like Podhale in the south of Małopolska and the multicultural Spisz. They mainly show women, their relationships, alliances, and shared activities. Mirga-Tas, in her artistic practice, is building the affirmative iconography of the largest European minority. There is 12 million Roma people living in Europe, to reimagine the place of the Romani people, the notoriously persecuted other, within the context of Western history of power and of course art history. She decolonizes not only imagination of Roma people, but also art by appropriating Callot images and reversing his stereotyping and stigmatizing iconography. But she decolonizes art history as well by using Ferrara frescoes, famous because of Aby Warburg essay, one of the key texts for Western art history and fundamental for iconography method. Mirga-Tas appropriates this method and creates new iconography, being aware of the image's power in creating imaginations. She also uses his idea, Warburg's idea of migration of images, this is Bildwanderung in German, and moves the iconographic motifs into the different direction. She says, can I have a next slide? Selecting a few topics related to the representation of Romani people in a stereotypical and stigmatizing way, I try to, next one. Selecting a few topics related to the representation of Romani people in a stereotypical and stigmatizing way, I try to disenchantment and demythologize them by reversing how we are being seen. Why this pavilion, I thought, is a good example for this presentation. Before going to Venice, I actually was not considering including it in my presentation, but after seeing it, I have realized that this is a multi-layered and carefully constructed statement in the colonial debate that took place in recent years in art and museum world. It touches the problem of the last acceptables in terms of like socially and politically acceptable forms of racism in Poland and other CEE countries that directs towards Roma people. The tragic history and stereotyping of the Romani people lurk underneath, and that makes it potent without an overt depiction of atrocities. The strong sense of life in the work of Mirga Tas, of connection between the protagonists who are going about their daily life, as well as the communal effort that goes into making these images on fabric, because this is the collective work of community. She was not sewing these panels by herself. It makes the exhibition a temporary asylum, offering the viewers hope and respite, as co-curators of this exhibition stated. So these are reasons that I have decided to present these examples, as we need, I think, this kind of affirmative history and iconography, changing arts and exhibitions in the near future. I have chosen this example also because it refers to the problem of institutional decolonization in the world of art and museums. It is the first time in the over 120-year history of the International Art Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia, a Roma artist is representing a national pavilion. But although it is the most prestigious global art show at the moment, and it's really hard to overestimate the positive manifestation of Polish Romani identity in Polish pavilion, it seems even more important to me that this project is presented to the public later on in Warsaw, in Poland, in Zachęta National Gallery of Art, so it could reach the broader audience than experts that are better or worse, but still familiar with the post-colonial discourse in art. So what are the colonial perspectives in the region? This is the last point I would like to speak a little bit about. I think that when we look at this ever-expanding field of post-colonial studies on CEE region, mostly in the discipline of history, we can notice how the earlier notion of colonialism is challenged and replaced by the broader one, reflecting the global dynamic and more complex phenomenon. When this particular experience and perspective of Central Eastern Europe is included. But in the field of museum studies in this region, there is still a significant gap between the post-colonial theory and the knowledge in the area of history and the museum research and practice, curatorial, educational, and any other practices. So there is still a space that needs to be filled in with new ideas, but also new practices. I think that we will witness in upcoming decades the increase of awareness of colonial entanglements of this region in terms of museum collections and artistic practices. This increase, of course, by artists, curators, but also the wider public will be more and more aware of these problems. So there will be a pressure on museum institutions to engage directly with this topic. There is, of course, always a possibility that museums in the region will be decolonized from the outside by artists and activists, especially if the political circumstances are not in favor of decolonial practices. But I believe that decolonization from within would be more effective and more durable, that the museum needs to take this effort to decolonize its own history and its own collection. And it's also a huge responsibility on the museum staff. So in the very end, I would like to recall Hanna's observation or thinking about the colonial thinking disposition. I think that she's right, that there is this skill of the colonial thinking that is needed here, the motivation for the colonial thinking, but also the specific sensitivity that I would connect with other terms that I am using, like empathy and vulnerability, to achieve this decolonial thinking virtue. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for having me in this discussion again.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. That was really fascinating, and I think a really wonderful compliment to Hanna Rudyk's paper. I felt like they were sort of in conversation with each other. I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about sort of recognizing a mythology and what the artist called this process of disenchantment. And perhaps that's something we can return to in our discussion. So again, thank you so much, Magdalena. If anyone has questions, please do make a note of them so that we can ask our panelists at the end. I am going to move us now to our third paper of this evening. And I will introduce our speaker. So our next speaker is Miroslava Maria Mudrak.
I'm very sorry, Stephanie. It seems like Miroslava had been disconnected from here. So if Olha is here, so maybe it will be possible to ask her and give the floor to her.
Yes, hello, I'm here.
Oh, thank you, Olha. So in that case, Olha, we will have Olha Honchar. Thank you so much for stepping in, and I will do your introduction now. Thank you. So Olha Honchar is a culturologist, project and communications manager, and anti-crisis manager. She is director of the Memorial Museum of Totalitarian Regimes, Territory of Terror in Lviv. Her research focuses on the features of PR, cultural and museum management in Ukraine, in particular in the regions. She is the communicator of the project's cultural diplomacy between the regions of Ukraine in the front line and liberated cities of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This one project is entitled "The Museum is Open for Renovation," and there is also an exhibition here and there, along with other exhibitions that she's worked on. She is also the co-curator of the experimental exposition of the anti-terrorist operation at the Luhansk Regional Museum in Staroblisk. And she is the initiator of the Museum Crisis Center and the Ambulance Museum project, which emerged in the first days of the Russian war against Ukraine. And her title today is, for her talk today, is Museum Military Mutual Help, the Experience of the Museum Crisis Center. So I'll hand over to you now, Olha. Thank you very much.
Hello. The topic of my report today is decolonization practice in the museum and colonization practice in the temporary occupied territory of Ukraine, particularly in occupied museum. When I was invited to consider decolonization practice in the museum, I understand that I don't think about territory of terror museum from this perspective. Because for me, what we do is decolonization by default, but we never called it that, and I did not specifically highlight it. I think this is related to the fact that the museum itself was created already in the time of Ukrainian independence, and I did not need to be decolonization. Also, I was born and worked already in an independent Ukraine, and therefore decolonization practice were not an organic request for me as well as for my team. What do I mean? For example, the main exhibition tells about the Holocaust, communistic terror, and repression in the voice of people, living witness of the most terrible events on the 20th century. Telling about this terrible page of history in our land, we follow the part the parts of presenting the personal story of their witness. That is, our main exposition is built on oral history archive. There are about 400 testimonies recorded by the museum over the past 10 years. They are personal stories of Lviv residents of Western Ukraine, who tell from their own life perspective what communist or Nazi terror is, and how a person finding himself in the grip of a totalitarian regime remains a person. Of course, from the point of view of the decolonization practice is one of the principles when we go from generalization, from depersonalization to actual personal story and living voices. I think you show my presentation when you can see the main exposition of Territory of Terror Museum and see this personal story in general exposition showing from video and other new technology. Because I don't see my presentation and I hope the moderator show. Yes or no, please give me.
Just a second, we are sharing it.
Okay, super, because I'm start, but okay, I'm continuing and you can show the main exposition and colleagues can see this personal story in the museum. Also working with the collection of Soviet monument art, monuments, sculpture, monuments that were moved from the public space of Lviv to us. This meant as a part of the communization process, we present them as a monuments that have received a new life in our museum. Being in the museum, they can finally speak not only from the perspective of monuments and their ritual function, but also tell the story of their creation, about their creator, the story of their ritual service, their decline and disappearance from the public space. The last point was often accompanied by scandals and discussion. We show different perspective, which is also one of the hallmark of decolonization practice. Multi-vocality and diversity are necessary components of decolonization practice. Now you can see we recorded this personal story, and next slide is present this personal story in the part of exhibition, and next slide it's also personal story and voice in permanent exhibition, and the next slide is this collection of Soviet monuments. And next slide, please. And the next. Okay, please stop. One of the project mentioned in the context of this report is our cooperation with contemporary Ukrainian artists, without who the modern museum and collection are impressive to complete, which is also a thing of decolonization practice. One of these is the project of Katarzyna Garden. She is a monumental artist, and her exhibition, she proposed to move the monuments I mentioned to the garden, thus depriving them of their totalitarian past, and imagines that perhaps in the distant future, they will become garden sculpture. Her paintings are placed in our colonnade of tyrants, which was supposed to depict war tyrants, but we use this colonnade for artistic interventions. Here it is worth noting that we as museum, as curator of the exhibition, emphasize that in context of decolonisation, the interpretation of Soviet heritage in the museum is also in a certain way artistic vandalism, because Katarzyna as an artist decided to reinterpret them in this way. When this happens in the museum, it's not vandalism, because because no one hides at night, does not secretly demolish monuments, and does not pour paint over them. Here the artist is naked. open and openly interprets the museum, which becomes a space for introspection of different opinions. We show one perspective of their monuments, but this does not mean that there is no other. In the same way, we are rethinking the Soviet past, not hiding it far away in the foundations, and as if it never existed, but inviting to a dialogue. This is also one of the principles of decolonization practice. Another project in this context is a joint project with the Atelier Нормальна Студия. You can show next slide. This Atelier Нормальна Студия and an associations that work with artists with Down syndrome. We had Artist Talk is a part of the European Heritage Days, where Evgeny Golubentsev, an artist with Down syndrome who interprets the Second World War, present his drawing on this topic. You can next slide. In particular, he is interested in cemeteries, burials, and memorials. He also read explanation for his work. It is possible that this project is one of the most important for me personally in this way. We gave our museum to the artist where he could realize himself professionally, especially in the context of the fact that people with Down syndrome were repressed by totalitarian regimes and great empires ignored their problem in very possible way. Our museum, which tells about totalitarian regime, organized such a project, which is very important for our team, is a kind of confrontations. We want our museum to be a platform for the realization of specialists in completely different fields, as well as for our various visitors. I believe that such a project can also be attributed to decolonization practice. Again, we never looked at this all, let's decolonize the museum. In my opinion, the museum from the very beginning until today, it's absolutely decolonization project in its essence. For us, this happened by default. We are a museum of the independent period and can be colonizing by nature. At the same time, as I already mentioned, I would like to talk about colonization. If we are located in Lviv, we have complete freedom to be kind of museums that I see as a director. A modern one talks about human dignity and freedom, makes sense of totalitarian regimes and show different sides, shows people lives in time of disaster, raises complex physical questions, collects a collection of Soviet monuments and interprets and preserves them. Despite this, I would like to talk about my colleagues from the Lugansk Region Museum of Local History who evacuated to Lviv after the beginning of Russia invasion. They were forced to leave their museums, their colleagues, and their collection because they could not evacuate it, which has been under occupation for 2 months. Even later, when they were taken away by the military, Ukrainian military, it was primarily about saving a life, not about the collection. This museum, like Starobinsk, instead was occupied from the first day, and real colonization practice begins here. Please, next slide. Until February 24, we cooperated with colleagues, and one of the project was the study of the ATO-OS exposition, the Russian-Ukrainian war from 2014 to February now, where we traveled with colleagues to the Museum of the Lugansk region and researched what museum workers collect and how they collect and it's a present of this in exhibition, how they understand the war, or which they are direct neighbors. In their museum, conference were held on the topic of the Holodomor, Holocaust, as well as research of nation land and its personalities, because it is Museum of Local History. I will add that he is moving for the second time. In 20 14 from Luhansk to Starobilsk, and now to Lviv. And now, when we observed what is happening there, we see real colonization. An exhibition or tradition present the history of Mother Great Russia with the so-called traditional symbols of the Russian Empire. Please, next slide. And you can see this screenshot from the social media when local team in Luhansk Regional Museum presents this exhibition or a tradition. You can read this. And please, next slide to see the picture of this oral tradition. This is presented holidays that take place in the museum. We are happy that we have to the so-called revelation. And we returning after this misunderstanding calendar independent of Ukraine to Mother Russia. This is position of occupied territory. So we see that museums are becoming center of propaganda, and this is a direct thing of colonization, and presenting propaganda copy is another colonizing approach to reach a larger audience. Please, next slide. You can see these exhibitions which look like copy of this oral tradition and symbol of Great Russia. And the team of the Lugansk Regional Museum of local participants in various activities in the level of Central City of Russia and their management. The next slide, please, and the exhibition ordinary fascism or Ukrainian flag are in the window here. Maybe they were taken from the exposition about the ATO-OS operation. Please, next slide. And this is screenshot is from this announce of this exhibition ordinary fascism, which and next slide, which create maybe from this you can see Ukrainian flag and as a symbol, and you see in the past slide that this is artifacts is from the this collection about ATO-OS exposition. And this collection, where they very quickly change their meaning. Under the rule of Ukraine, this was evidence of the war that taking place directly in the Lugansk region. And now it is served under the guide of ordinary fascism. Or, for example, a message about the transfer to the museum, a photo of some Russia liberating figure. This character is glorified and transformed into a deity. Heroization of individual character is another example of colonization practice. In this way, the museum becomes a platform of propaganda for glorifying the heroes defined by the center state source. And this is only the example that was tracked. Now we are more focused on the continual of our project. We have resumed the recording of witness of our profile topic, Nazi and communist terror, and we also record witness of the modern war taking place on the territory of Ukraine in particular, and we will record museum workers how they feel about this work. Please, next slide. I thank you for the opportunity to think about it, consider it, and present it. But unfortunately, there will be more and more such examples in the occupied territories. Now we are paying more attention to helping our colleagues to survive. Since March 3, the Museum Crisis Center has been engage in raising funds and provide them to museum workers who have found themselves in difficult life situation, but continue to stay in Ukraine and collect collection. In particular, we meditate between those who provide help and those who need it. Investigation colonization practice is not our central focus, as our primary object is to win and survive. Although in itself survive in the condition of genocide, in particular the culture one that is taking place, it's already opposition to colonization. Also, of course, it's important, and it would be good if someone undertook to investigate and monitor the situation. Perhaps after my report, such an initiative of a person will appear of volunteer and will be happy, and we will be happy to cooperate. This horror that is happening in the occupied territory, to destroy the culture and kill of the culture people who create meaning is colonization and the darkness that has come to our lands. We also know about the fact of kidnapping and torture. It is also part of colonization practice. The Evelyn part does not tolerate people who make sense. It has a general course and no one has the right to question it. Speaking today about the example of our museum in the creating of decolonization practice and the situation of the Lugansk Regional Museum of Local History in the temporary occupied territory is an example of colonization practice. I want to once again draw attention of the international community, museum colleagues, to the fact that Russia is a terroristic state. And we must make everyday effort to stop the war, because it's not only a war against Ukraine, but also a war against the democratic world, its values and world of culture, which Ukraine culture is a part. And I want to end with is a thesis that might seem unusual for Europeans, but for the past 6 months, absolutely organic for Ukrainians. In addition to those who are engaged in or protecting professionally, for all the rest, in particular, museum workers and works in the culture sphere, the biggest opposition is to continue doing their work. Despite the news, despite the lack of sleep, despite the sirens and loss relatives and friends. Drink morning coffee, go down to bomb shelter when necessary, and continue there, write, create, documented, safe. Standing on guard of the culture code and living fully is our most powerful confrontation and the main focus of Museum Crisis Center. Stand no matter what. From decolonization to colonization, it's one step. And this step is the denial of the other or oneself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olha. It's a really powerful example of, I think, the reality of what colonial violence looks like. And, you know, thank you for being here tonight and for sharing that with us. I was really taken by sort of, I don't know, the journey that your museum has gone on and how, you know, initially you weren't necessarily thinking of decolonization, but you're now in this, you know, the what's happening at the moment is really underlining the purpose and value of an institution like yours. And I'm sure that we'll have lots of questions for you in the panel. But thank you so much for contributing. We really appreciate it. Again, if you have any questions for Olha, please do hold on to those and we will share them you know, very soon. But we still have one more paper tonight. So I'm going to, I believe that Miroslava has now successfully reconnected. Brilliant. Thank you. Welcome back. And so what I'll do is just do a brief introduction as usual. Let me just find my place. So thank you for rejoining us. So Miroslava Maria Mudrak is Professor Emerita in the History of Art at The Ohio State University, specializing in the field of modernist art of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her scholarly interests focus on Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and the former Soviet Union in relation to the philosophical and stylistic developments of the West. For more than 3 decades, she taught at The Ohio State University and lectured on the ideological discourses, socio-political influences, and artistic practice within East European cultures that used modernity to signify national identity. Mudrak's seminal work, New Generation and Artistic Modernism in Ukraine of 1986 was awarded the Kovalyov Prize for Ukrainian Studies and was published in Ukrainian translation by Rodovit Press in 2018. Other publications include essays on Ukrainian Dada and dissidents, propaganda pavilions, the Ukrainian Studio of Plastic Arts in Prague, Panfuturism and Constructivism. She has contributed essays for exhibition catalogues on collections of Russian and Ukrainian avant-garde art to include Red Horizon, 2018, Daniel Berliuk in 1882 to 1967, Futurism and After, 2008, From the Lotus to the Sickle, The Art of Boris Kosarev in 2012, and she has also curated the exhibition Staging the Ukrainian Avant-Garde of the 1910s and 1920s, whose catalogue was recognized by the 2016 Alfred H. Barr Jr. Award for Smaller Museums, Libraries, Collections, and Exhibitions under the auspices of the College Art Association. Her latest publication on Ukraine's premier modern graphic designer, The Imaginative World of Georgy Nabut and the Making of a Ukrainian Brand, published 2020, has been translated into Ukrainian and French just last year. And in 2020, Mudrak was elected as a foreign member to the National Academy of Arts of Ukraine. She is also a full member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society of America. And her paper today is entitled On De-Imperializing Ukrainian Modern Art from Museum Registries. Thank you very much, Miroslava.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I apologize to my colleagues for having to step out for a bit. My internet was lost temporarily. May I have the first slide, please? As I've been listening to the talks, absolutely mesmerized by the conceptual aspects, in addition to the very practical aspects that have ensued or that I think about in relation to the conceptual idea of decolonization, I realized that I can't seem to step over into the term decolonize because I feel that I am maybe stuck, but feel more properly ensconced in the concept of de-imperializing, which I think one has to first go through before you can actually see the colonizing aspects of life under empires that Ukraine has had to endure. So I'd like to start with some maps. The next slide, please. And just again, going back to what Kasia had shown us in terms of mapping Ukraine's existence. Here I'm showing you maps of the early 20th century. These were taken from the Washington Post recently, but it does give you an idea about the main concept and the main drive behind my talk, which is that Ukrainian modernism was born on lands that overlapped the purview of 2 ruling empires at the turn of the 20th century. The Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled much of Ukraine in the west, the Russian Empire in the east. Within the caesures of political maneuverings after World War I, when the nefarious strategies of occupying powers trammeled, besieged, divided, and occupied historically ethnic Ukrainian territories, Ukrainian artists still managed to retain their integrity as a creative people. Despite the displacement and the dispiritedness of wartime trauma, as they are again witnessing today and experiencing today, they engaged with the contemporary world to counter their circumstances and to bring attention to their situation. Undeterred, they trained where they could at that time, mostly in studios or local art schools established by academic painters in larger cities, whether it be Lviv, Kyiv, Kharkiv, or Odessa. But to legitimize their credentials, they also traveled to the academies of Europe, mostly Berlin, Vienna, or they would attend private schools in Munich and in Paris. For those living in the Eastern occupied lands, Moscow and St. Petersburg served as their destination. Split between East and West, the phenomenon of Ukrainian modernism would thus represent hubs of innovative activity tied to indigenous cultural habits, shared worldviews, and loyalties. It is these mores that, despite the diversity of styles and approaches, allow us to speak of shared characteristics within Ukrainian modernist expression, which rarely is captured in museum inventories and less so in exhibitions. So I'd like to talk about the way Ukrainian modernism is represented in American museums, since this is where I live. And this has been my frustration for my entire professional life. Next slide, please. I'd like to remind you of this East-West dichotomy, which we have in the history of Ukrainian modernism. Just to remind you of the Yalta Conference and the division of Ukraine, further division of Ukraine in 1945. And just as a little bit of leitmotif, next slide, please. I'll give you, no, not that one, previous. On the right, you see the image of Kumar Melamed after they came to the United States, showing you really the disregard of dividing up territory as if not only the lands could be moved as on a chessboard, but the people were disposable. The people who lived on the lands were disposable. The result of all of this is now the next slide, please. Museum labels such as this. Now, this isn't from American museums. I could probably create an entire inventory of museum labels in American museums, which are absolutely confusing. But this happened to be a post from my colleague, Czarnecki, Vitaly Czarnecki, a literary historian who happened to be in Germany at the Berlin Nationalgalerie. And the juxtaposition of these two is very, very telling. On the left, you have Alexander Archipenko. I hope you can see it. Born in the Russian Empire, right? Died in New York. And then there is, I hope you can see a little UK behind the Russian Empire. And I guess it's a US above New York, which would indicate, I guess, the present circumstances of these geographic regions. But then juxtaposed with that is Polish artist Hanna Rudyk label, which shows her being born in Warsaw, which was also under imperial rule at the time, but she happened to be born in Moscow. One wonders, you know, where the consistency is in this kind of labeling. Concentrate on the labels in museums, you begin to realize that there is not only great inconsistency, but great mistruths also being presented to a viewing public who, if they're not discriminating enough or curious enough, or if they don't complain about it, this is the way that we teach the viewing public about history, about geography, and in this particular case, about the existence or non-existence of a Ukrainian artistic modernist culture. The next slide, please. For my part, trained in the United States as an academic, my training had to come from publications, standard publications that were used across the board in university curricula, which perpetuated imperial myths. And there was no way to counter this, as entire departments of Slavic culture and history and language perpetuated the same myths. So looking back, or at this very moment, as Ukraine is trying to fight off Russian invasion, you realize that throughout the 20th century, and indeed now into the 21st century, the entire world has been conducting itself, even professionally, based on these myths that have been perpetuated in the case of art history by publications that had no alternative sources. I give you an example on the left of the Art and Architecture of Russia. First published in 1954. So this, I assume, was in the wake of the thaw, or after Khrushchev's death, or after Khrushchev's death in the beginning years of the thaw. With the second edition in 1975, which means already we're in the period of the Cold War. And then again in 1983. So the same text, no changes. I don't know how well you could read, but the first chapters refer to Kyiv and Russia. Now, of course, this is exactly the subject of Putin's rewriting of history, that there is no, that Rus, Kyiv and Rus really is the beginnings of Russia. And as we saw earlier on in Kasha's maps, we know that there was no Russia during the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Only with the rise of Muscovy can we speak of a Russia. The next slide, please. Another book that is standard for the study of, let's say, Russian culture and art is this one, Tamara Talbot Rice, A Concise History of Russian Art. Again, if you look at, this was published in 1963. If you look at the beginning chapters, it's the culture of Kyiv and Russia. And so it goes. Anyone in America who would be, or in Great Britain, because these were also widely distributed in Great Britain. Thames and Hudson was responsible for publishing this. Anyone interested in the study of Russian culture would encounter these as basic texts, and within it, any mention of Ukrainian contributions would be non-existent. Before I get ahead of myself, I'd like to just read a little bit of my text. All of this is to say, I feel, is that the forces of imperialism have taken root, had taken strong root in the American consciousness and in the Western world. The forces of this imperialism touted political and cultural superiority of the very forces that would leave little space for cultures deemed inferior by the rulers of these empires. And I'm speaking here specifically of the Russian Empire. Indeed, for most of the 19th century even, Ukraine was widely known in the West as La Petite Russie, Little Russia. And the French love to use that phrase, La Petite Russie, because for them it meant the quaint ethnographic peasant craft of all those regions, those anomalous regions that fell under the purview of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Again, there was absolutely no reference to these being a different ethnos, these being an ethnos with very different roots, very different aspirations, very different sense of aesthetic. Furthermore, the Tsars banned the language. If they banned the language, the Ukrainian language, it would mean that there was no way for the people to promote their culture, especially with the printed word. The Ukrainian press was banned by an edict by the Tsar. No theatrical performances, which would allow for public engagement. And so essentially, the entire Ukrainian culture was being quashed by Tsarist rule, Tsarist edict. And I only draw your attention again to the very same politics that Putin is enforcing and touting, that there is no Ukrainian nation, there are no Ukrainian people, there is no Ukrainian language, it's all Russia. And his intent is to destroy all of that. Unless we think any otherwise, we are, I think, sorely mistaken, to destroy it all, and in order to bring in the Russian world, to occupy it and to replace it. By banning the language, by destroying its people's struggle for freedom, the Russian Tsars would make certain that Ukraine was not ever seen as a real country, that the Ukrainians did not exist except for their quaint ethnographic practices, and that they ultimately would simply be seen as one Russian people. And certainly that worked. That narrative worked when it comes to the United States, when it comes to Western Europe, that this is all one great Russian people. The active promotion of the Little Russians as a civilizational subset of Great Russia was only the first step, in my opinion, toward the construction of a mythical superior civilization, a monolith, a curiosity as well, that intrigued on a global scale. Like a successful modern marketing scheme, the concept of Great Russia seduced an entire world, even the scrupulous, into facile, undiscriminating biases that have manipulated Western consciousness and have been proven deleterious to Ukrainian identity. Russian propaganda has not relinquished this role today and continues, internally at least now, to mold its own population with this misguided and faulty mindset. Thankfully, we live in the era of technology, of social media, of immediate reportage, and the rest of the world is able to see reality and truth. So the intent of my talk is to provide some insight into the consequences of this mentality in the shaping of American art collections of the modernist period, especially those with the Russian focus. Much has already been said about the colonizing forces of this mentality, and more will be examined over these 2 days. But my contribution is straightforward and very obvious: to bring attention to the lingering legacies of imperial attitudes in American museum life that for over a century now have sidelined the contributions of Ukrainian artists to the history of modernism. Mostly, I would like to shed light on how unexamined museum practices perpetuate Russian branding and therefore ultimately fall short in their mission to educate the public with a historical perspective. And so the next slide, please. I'd like to show you or inform you, if you're not aware of the fact, of this museum that opened recently in Minneapolis, which is called the Museum of Russian Art, known by its acronym TMORA. It was founded by a collector who was fond of Russian Impressionist painting. And I only bring it up because collectors have played a major role in perpetuating this myth about Russian culture in American museum life. Of course, collectors are the ones who donate their collections. They're the ones who build the Russian sections of American museums. And we have to deal with them as benefactors because they are doing and believe they are doing a good deed in donating the works that they've collected over a long period of time to be available to a larger public. However, please, the next slide. One has to question sometimes whether they've thought through the mission. The title of the museum, the name of the Museum of Russian Art, already implies an imperial narrative. But if you look at the described mission of this particular museum, it promotes understanding of the art, people, and culture of, note, Muscovite Russia. This is going back to Talbot, Rice, and Hamilton, the history of Russia, the Russian Empire, and the former republics of the Soviet Union. And so they list these former republics, and because they list this in their mission, contributions that will be Ukrainian will be found in the Museum of Russian Art. Anything, be it Ukrainian or Armenian or any one of these other republics of the former Soviet Union, will be considered Russian art. And so the story goes. So I'd like to take one step further. The next slide, please. And have us think about collectors and their role in the shaping of American art collections. I'm showing you two images from the Barnes collection in Philadelphia. Barnes was an industrialist. Oh, no, I think he was, I can't remember now his profession, a doctor maybe. But he traveled throughout Europe, and he bought what he liked. He bought, not for the sake of building a collection, he simply bought what attracted him, what he found to be quality pieces. And in the Barnes collection, we have a large collection of the Ukrainian artist, Aleksa Hryshchenko, who was central to the development of the avant-garde in the teens in Ukraine, as well as in Russia. And later, very important as a French painter. And in the Barnes collection, we have these wonderful works by, I think there are over 14 works by Hryshchenko. I can't tell you now about any kind of background information. All I know is that Barnes has placed the works of Hryshchenko in the context of modernism. So there's no kind of questioning of the Russian narrative that would apply to other kinds of collections or the other kinds of museum practices, which would try to highlight a certain myth or narrative about collections that came from the former empire. There'll be more to say about the Barnes collection, but I just want to continue with my thought here. The next slide, please. In the early part of the 20th century, Catherine Dreyer, who was a painter, who participated in the Armory Show of 1913 in New York, befriended another newcomer to the United States, Alexander Archipenko, and that friendship lasted her entire life. But Catherine Dreyer still had this mentality of, Archipenko being a Russian artist, someone who came from Russia. And Archipenko, for his part, probably in building his career, displaced from his homeland, having traversed through the capitals of Europe and now finding himself in the United States, probably wasn't making a big deal about his national background. But at the Armory Show, the next slide, please, he did contribute a good number of works, which Catherine Dreyer quickly bought. She was a woman of wealth, and the works of Archipenko intrigued her as good as quality works of modernism, and she thus began her own collection of modernism that really brought to the attention of her peers the talent that was really coming from the former empire. And so I'd like to show you the next slide, please. Among them, many Ukrainian artists, specifically Louis Lozovic, who, if you look at these highlighted areas, is listed as American, born Russia, Ukraine, and the dates. These are listings that come from the Yale University Art Gallery, to which Catherine Dreyer donated many works from her collection. There's also Burlyuk, David Burlyuk, whom Dreyer collected prolifically, who is listed here as American, born Ukraine. One wonders, I mean, the dates are more or less of the same era. Burlyuk born in 1882, Lozovic born in 1892. Why one would be born in Russia, one Ukraine, I don't know. So just pointing out inconsistencies and the way that they happen to develop in museum collections. The next slide. Again, to emphasize Dreyer's role in allowing us, the American public, to see collections of Ukrainian artists among Russian artists in American museums. These are two more works by Burlyuk at the Yale Art Gallery. And the next one, please. Perhaps one of the most controversial in terms of ethnic background, Kazimir Malevich, again, who's listed at Yale Gallery as Russian, Ukraine, and the dates. So confusion throughout. The next slide, please. The works by Archipenko that have been gifted to the Yale Art Gallery, again, inconsistencies, but nonetheless, they exist, and how interesting it would be to really separate out this contingent of Ukrainian artists out of these modernist collections in American museums, to really do a separate exhibition to see what contributions, what features, what particular characteristics define their art in the midst of the developing modernism around them. The next slide, please. Here we have Louise Nevelson, also other Ukrainian artists represented in the Yale University Art Gallery. Sonia Delaunay, born Russia, Ukraine. Louise Nevelson, American, born Ukraine. Very hard to figure out the rationale for these kinds of designations. The next slide. In 1922, when the first Russian art exhibition was sponsored in Berlin, there'll soon be coming out a nice compendium of essays on the opening of this exhibition in Berlin in 1922. One of the key promoters of that exhibition was Konstantin Umansky, who was Ukrainian by birth, but became a very important diplomat within the Soviet Union, and published in German this book of Neue Kunst in Russland, which again, with the books that I mentioned early on, would become one of the first fundamental textbooks of learning about Russian art in a context outside of Russia. And Lozovic also in 1925 published a book in English on modern Russian art. Lozovic, another Ukrainian, who helped to promote Russian art collections within the United States. I should say that Lozovik's book and Umansky's book are the very books that Alfred Barr used in order to inform himself when he went to Russia to do his dissertation work, and when he discovered as well the Russian avant-garde, which eventually became a pretty solid an important component of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Let's continue. I hope I'm not taking up too much time. I'm going to run through these now. The next slide, please. I'd like to bring to your attention once again another classic book for anybody studying Russian art, and that is Camilla Gray's subsequent editions of what initially was called the Great Experiment in Art, Russian art from 1863 to 1922, which in its subsequent editions, published by Thames and Hudson, came to be known as the Russian Experiment in Art, without batting an eye. But what we have on the cover of this particular edition is the work of Tatlin. And Tatlin, for all of his contributions to the Russian avant-garde, is also connected to the Ukrainian avant-garde in ways that no one, even the ultra formalists, have really paid attention to. And that is that as a musician playing the Ukrainian national instrument, the bandura, one could hypothesize that the construction of this form, the bandura, the instrument, with its contours, its strings, its materiality, wood and metal, that certainly, if we go to the next slide, please, would have played into the concepts surrounding the tower or his Letatlin, because after all, and the next slide, please, he was involved with the Ukrainian literary avant-garde and did this cover in 1927, in which he is using exactly those elements of metal and wire and industrial material to speak about communication between poets in a technological age. The next slide. Here we have the catalog to the Paris exhibition of 1925, the International Exposition of Industrial and Decorative Arts. I only bring it to your attention in order to indicate once again that Ukrainian stage designers brought in winning maquettes that were recognized by everyone, especially the jury, at this international exhibition, but every single one of them was labeled Russian. Clearly, the contribution was made not by the individual republics of the Soviet Union, but by the USSR in total, but there was no recognition, even when the winner of the prize-winning maquette was from Kharkiv, Vadim Meller. The next slide, please. When an American came, maquettes, saw the exposition in Paris, he brought most of the works to the American scene and put on a huge exhibition in New York of these theatrical designs. And in what amounted to be the catalog, which was actually a journal called The Little Review. The next slide, please. There was no mention of Ukraine. Meller was indicated as coming from Kyiv, Russia. I just have a few slides left, so let's go to the next. It is very gratifying that the Museum of Modern Art in New York, since I mentioned it before, with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, has devoted even after reformulating all of its modernist galleries, has reformulated one gallery, devoting it to Ukrainian artists. They call it, it's Gallery 507, and it's called In Solidarity. And here you'll see their attempt at bringing together artists who were born in Ukraine, no longer indicated as Russian, brought into one ensemble for people to begin to realize, at least momentarily, that there is a difference between the cultures. One of the surprises within this show, the next slide, please, is the work of Janet Sobel, who basically is an unknown, but was very instrumental, or was very important in the abstract expressionist movement in the United States. And if you take a minute to look at the description of the inclusion of these works in the Solidarity gallery, I think it brings into focus the diverse nature of Ukrainian contributions to modern art. The curator focuses on the emigration of Janet Sobel as a Jew to the United States, and brings in a really rich dimension, which oftentimes is excluded from the way that Russian art is just lumped together under the rubric of Russian. Some final slides, please. The next one. There are certain ways that museums can begin to differentiate the ethnic and specifically Ukrainian contributions of artists, and that is not to use the Russian alphabet in the transcriptions or transliterations of their names. Ukrainian has 4 letters that are used in surnames that do not exist in Russian. So this notion of language is critical in reestablishing a new kind of classification system to separate out Ukrainian artists from their Russian compatriots. And it's important, and it's so important because, for example, the next slide, we have collectors again who are collecting artists who they name Russian artists, like Alexander Bogomazov, who then go into museum registries as Bogomazov, when in fact the Ukrainian name of this artist is Bohomazov, because it is using the Ukrainian transliteration rather than the Russian transliteration. The next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one so we can, the next slide, please. Other names, Yermilov, the Russian transliteration would be Ermilov. We're speaking about a Ukrainian artist who never worked in Russia, and we should retain the letter Ye, which does not exist in Russian. The next one. Using this linguistic note, performance artists, the Fast Reaction Group, created a performance in which they actually focus on these missing letters in the Russian alphabet. The next one, please. And closer in time to the war in Ukraine today, the artist Kadyrova at the Biennale has put on a display. She usually makes these installations of Ukrainian breads, which are these round breads, which are called which is a palyanitsia, which apparently when the Russian soldiers came into Ukraine, they could not pronounce, and hence that was one telltale sign that you were not dealing with the native, but you were dealing with the enemy. So all of this is to say that I think maybe I'll make my concluding comments now. Just as current studies on diversity and inclusion have begun to define cultural balance in building museum collections, so the present-day assault on Ukraine, which has finally exposed the mechanisms of Russia's imperialist operations and their far-reaching effects in dampening the voices and presence of those under their immediate control, should bring us, the global community, to a more measured, objective, and discerning means of differentiating cultural patterns, contributions, and separate modes of communicating the modernist spirit through the visual arts, especially as concerns Russia. Museums, publishers, and institutions of higher learning need to rise above popular attitudes woven into the consciousness of the West through insidious Russian propaganda that has wormed its way into American intellectual consciousness in the early part of the 20th century and that has persisted to this day. The institutional funding of museums on the part of Russian oligarchs continues to skew our vision of modernity through the monetary influence of their Russocentric lens as they sit on museum boards. My only message is that it behooves all of us who visit museums to look carefully at labels, scrutinize the information, and always call into question dubious and/or arbitrary assignations in the case of Russian artworks on display. Inattention to these small details makes American museums complicit in passing along misinformation that only perpetuates the myth and makes us unwitting players as observers in Russia's imperial aims. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Miroslava. I was just fascinated by some of the examples you showed there of cataloguing and labelling as a very situated practice and what can happen when we don't pay attention. So thank you so much for that. So we now actually have, thank you, we now have a bit of time at the end for questions and discussion. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm aware that others will as well. So I would like to open the floor. So if anyone has a question, you can either you can raise your hand. You can write a question in the chat, whichever you would prefer. Cassia,
Can you hear me? No, you cannot hear me.
yes. Oh, I can hear you now. Yes, sorry.
Okay, very good.
Kasia,
So, above all, I just wanted to say again, also from me, thank you to all the participants. It was actually amazing panel. All papers were so interesting, so profound, so well studied, with so many hugely interesting and kind of many unpublished examples. So I think that we are witnessing something, you know, a kind of something very important. I think that the materials are definitely from this panel should be published in a special journal. We will be thinking about it later. And just my kind of attempt to put them together. Don't worry, I won't be speaking for too long. But in a way, the first paper was about the concept of decolonizing and new vocabulary. Incredibly interesting, very theoretical, but food for thought. The second one was about decolonial practices, also incredibly well studied by Magdalena. The first one was by Hanna. Then it was a chilling paper presenting, you know, a kind of witness, hands-on example of the contemporary practice of colonization of of museum in Luhansk. I mean, the Museum of History. Am I right, Luhansk, or is it Lugansk? I can hear you. Miroslav, I can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
There's the issue of language.
Yes.
In Russian, it would be Lugansk.
That's right. So I was right to say Luhansk.
In Ukrainian, it's Luhansk.
So it's not Luhansk, but Luhansk. Okay, very good. So that was that. I mean, I wasn't in a way prepared. I didn't know, and this image of those suited men who were introduced to this indoctrination I mean, it shows that the museums are definitely not neutral. So the whole idea of neutrality is completely thrown through should be thrown out. I mean, it has already been thrown out. And eventually, and finally, an amazing paper by Miroslava about the ways in which the cultural appropriation of Ukrainian culture by Russia has been perpetuated, in a way legitimized by both academic publications, which are not neutral at all, and by collectors and their museums. And only one good example, a kind of hope, a sign of hope, was this MoMA exhibition in Solidarity. When was it open? The MoMA exhibition in Solidarity? Or you are frozen? Miroslava, you are frozen. Oh, you are muted. You are both muted and frozen now. When was it open, this exhibition? It was probably in effect of the war, wasn't it?
I think it was March or April, really,
yes.
after.
It was early March.
Yeah.
Yes. So that was a concert, really, this panel. And I'm just thinking, because I was thinking about the question that I could ask to all of you, but I mean, the first would be, perhaps I have two questions. One is more specific. The impact of the war on the vocabulary of the war in Ukraine, on the vocabulary of decolonization, and this theory and concept of decolonization. In a way, this is most to Hanna, but anybody could tell me something about that. I mean, could present their views. And the second question, which probably I will be thinking about it, and it is the relationship between those three terms, critique, queering, and decolonizing. Is decolonizing new critique and new queering? Is decolonizing now the major approach, and does it kind of invalidate the older terms like the critical museum, or queering the collections? So this is something that I've been thinking a lot recently, whether the concept of decolonizing, because of Walter Mignolo and because of this critique of the Western episteme and Western language altogether, in a way invalidates the concept of critique as Western, and the concept of queering as kind of partial. I don't know. That's a perhaps difficult question, and perhaps we can answer it on the second day. But the first is about the impact of the war on the vocabulary and conceptualization of decolonization.
I can suggest my vision of this question, if I may. As I have said, it seems to me that the war encouraged decolonization vocabulary and the term itself and all its derivatives to rotate more actively in Ukrainian public and professional discourses. And as I have noticed, it mostly meant de-Russification and decommunization, and which is absolutely natural and which is good for me. But to my mind, we shall add the global context to it, which is both fair and productive to define our status quo, first of all, and then to elaborate, to work out our possible paths of decolonizing out of this, or not out of this, but within this broader context. It seems to me it will be truer to our situation, to our history, to people involved and not involved directly in the Ukrainian history, but who also deserve memory, attention, and voice. And of course, I'm speaking from the position of a curator of the non-Western art museum or non-Western collection. That's why I'm feeling so I'm so sensitive to other histories, and they resonate to me very much with the Ukrainian histories, or with the histories of Polish Roma people and other people whose voices were silenced and marginalized and degraded in the museums. But I think that we should broaden that discourse and made it both professionally and publicly more wide. And we should learn the history of colonialism, because it's a very important lesson that the world cultures and the human, actually the human beings got through or are getting through, and are to which the lesson itself should be acquired, should be how to call it, processed. Yeah, this knowledge should be processed for any aim that we are now setting for us ahead, for the better future, for the life in the future, for culture and all that things. And I agree with you, Katarzyna, that all today's presentations were all about the fact that museums have been used as an instrument of powers, of politics, of sharing and asserting certain ideas which embodied this split of humanity into superior people and lower people, subhuman people. And that's why museums should radically reconsider themselves, because they were complicit and they should stop being complicit. That is, I agree totally with you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Magdalena and then Tetyana would like to come in.
I would like to briefly comment on the problem of the language change, because we had discussion in the Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw like 2 months ago. We were discussing decolonial approaches in Polish, but not only Polish museums, and we realized that our language actually changed significantly after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, because we stopped saying on Ukraine, like the Ukraine would be a vast land, something that is rather a geographic category than the political one in terms of political state. So everyone now is speaking in Ukraine, and people are, even if they make this mistake, they are correcting themselves, and it's not only in the academic bubble. And we also touched the more complex problem of the eastern, so-called eastern borderlands of Poland. And we were trying to figure out how can we change this terminology, because I mean, we are now saying rather so-called eastern borderlands, like taking this into quotation marks, but again, this is not a proper solution. It should be somehow changed. And I was referring in my presentation briefly Bogusław Bakuła, who wrote an article about the Polish borderland studies. I mean, he's asking the question, if someone wants to be called a Polish borderland, the population, people, communities living there. So there is a problem with the vocabulary. Some things were changed rapidly, others needs to be changed. And the second question, which is really like a fundamental one, is decolonial approach in museums, a new critique or new querying. I think it is. I mean, at least in the practice, I would like to now not to speak, not to reflect on the theory, because I think that in theory it's much more complicated. John Oldfield makes this clear distinction between colonialism and imperialism that I recalled, but I'm not sure if we all should believe him and follow his distinction. But I think that there is something about the terminology, how we think about the colonial approach to the museums, collections, and in general in the culture. And I think that it is now replacing this museum critique that we witnessed in 80s and 90s. This is a new museum critique. And I think there is also something about queering the museum. I do not have, I cannot elaborate more on this concept, but I think that that you are somehow right. It is against all these categories and all these norms that museum is actually imposing in our culture. So I would agree with your intuition, Kasia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have to discuss it yet, but further. But there is Tetyana, I think, but I love your points. And
Thank
of course,
you.
Hanna's
Thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you to all of the presenters for such thoughtful evening. I really have a lot of questions and a lot of comments, but just two things I want to put on the table and to ask you about. One is actually, I just wanted to refer to one case that occurred to me while we were speaking about these different angles. In the United Kingdom, and I was surprised to know about that, to learn about that. The colonial imperial history is not taught at schools. So kids don't get any education in the British imperial past unless they are, particularly interested, or they go to study history in the university. So basically, they don't get that in their experience until they get mature. But the only thing that where they learn about it is literature, and that's the writings of Joseph Conrad. And Joseph Conrad, as you know, was born in Ukraine, and he was of a Polish origin. So, I mean, that's how interesting how he had this sensitivity, and something, again, that we kind of refer to all the time when we're talking about decoloniality. You need to be sensible. You need to have this ability to see these things, to feel them, and to reflect on them. And he had somehow been of this, Ukrainian, Polish, from this Ukrainian Polish context, he was sensitive enough to bring up this question in the UK culture, and to actually be that person who tells about it, speaks about it. So I just wanted to give this kind of a case that is outside of our conversation, doesn't have to do with museums, but it helps also to understand how it works, how this optics works. And actually going to my question, this series of talks is part of the broader, the wider work on decoloniality that we're trying to help and this process to help happen in internationally, actually, yeah. So we don't limit ourselves to like West or East or whatever. And there is a question on how to do it. Yeah. So like, what are the instruments, the practical instruments that we need to follow up with all of this conversation? Of course, we need to kind of, put this on the table, get aware that there is a problem, speak about it. But do you think such a practical instrument as, let's say, the guide on decoloniality relating to the former Russian Empire would be a useful and effective instrument in such case? So it's just a test of the idea that we are developing at the moment. And if you would just share your thoughts on it, I would be grateful.
I guess this might be a question to Magdalena.
Well, as a person who took this task to write a guide for practitioners, I would say, I cannot judge my work, but what I've learned while working on this book, this guide with Cilla, was that we can really learn a lot from the examples, that it really makes sense to describe the practices, because first of all, we learn how to analyze them. We develop new categories, new terms. We were, of course, thinking globally and searching what can connect different examples. We developed like 6 categories, very general, like empathy was one of them, or vulnerability. Sorry, Katarzyna, could you tell?
Vulnerability.
Vulnerability, yes, of course, but also transparency, very like fundamental thing for museum functioning, not only in decolonial perspective, but particularly because of this discussion on restitution, the transparency is really one of the crucial points. So we were like searching for these intersectional categories that could be adapted to all these global examples. But on the other hand, we learned how to describe these particular examples within the particular historical or political context. So we also learned a lot during this process. I'm not sure how is it used now by museum professionals or practitioners. I got some feedback, but I think that there is a sense in such an effort, because it always, especially that if you write a guide, you need to clarify your ideas. You need to clarify the vocabulary. It must be really, simple on some level. And then I think it's, again, coming back to the issue of vocabulary that Katarzyna asked first. I think it's really an important task. It's like really the beginning for the work in the field. So that is my experience of writing this book rather than using.
Yes, thank you so much. It's Hanna who, I'm sorry, Stephanie, that because I can see I can see a raised hand. Hanna, you want to?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, if I may. As to this decolonial guidebook, I think that it would be a really good thing to do, to introduce some basic conceptual things. So just to start from some certain complex of ideas, I remember that the ECOS project where Magdalena was involved, your team did this toolkit that suggested certain notions, certain concepts, ideas, and also some reading, basic reading on it. And it was, for me personally, it was very insightful and good start. So as getting back to the Katarzyna's question, there is not, the discourse of decoloniality hasn't been developed yet in Ukraine, in Ukrainian humanitarian thought. So such an introduction would be very good. And again, I would, as to its practical part, it should have to have practical part, of course, with examples, the way Magdalena's and Chila's book was organized. It was very smart and very interesting structure. And I would suggest that it should consist of, again, global examples with the emphasis on one hand on, for instance, Polish examples, which is to a certain extent closer to Ukrainian kind of sort of ambivalent coloniality, and on the other hand, of examples from subaltern countries and communities of the most recent time, because if Magdalena's and Chila's book took the selected interesting versions of decolonial practices up to the 2021, now it has been happening much more, and we have to use this most advanced, of course, it's advanced experience. So let's target on the recent examples, not only classical one. That's my view.
Thank you so much. I wonder whether that should be a new edition of the book, or a second volume, or a completely different book. Whether, because I have actually listed those in Magdalena, in yours and Chila's book. You have those major chapters, kind of creating visibility, increasing inclusivity, decentering, championing empathy, improving transparency, embracing vulnerability. And they are such a meta concepts. And obviously, as you explained, it was very difficult to arrive at those concepts, and they had to be meta concepts. But eventually, I'm not criticizing your book. On the contrary, I think your book is wonderful. But there are certain dangers that eventually this. And please don't, I really don't criticize, but it is so true. It is almost like a sermon, you know. We have to be good. We have to be good to other people. I wonder, and you did it because of this mega problem. You know, perhaps there was no other way, but I'm just thinking, I don't know what I'm thinking, but can we be more explicit sometimes in those, even in those general concepts? What Miroslava has shown, that was very explicit, the issue of labeling, for instance, and the issue of, I don't know, wall texting. No, I'm just thinking. I haven't got any solution. I'm just throwing my anxiety into the open. Simply, I'm sharing my anxiety with you.
Got two hands up. Are they? Did you want to come in, Magdalena?
Reply to Kasia, just a quick reply that all these practical matters like labeling are hidden in examples. So when we are writing about Tropen Museum, which is example of creating visibility, we write about the meaning of the label, museum label, and we give the very practical examples of these big ideas. Yes. But I would agree with Katarzyna that there is a danger, or there is a risk in these big concepts, big ideas that are going to, I don't know, to somehow cross all these regional differences and context. And the problem was, of course, the project deliverables. So this kind of book just needed to be prepared and written. So that was a huge task for us to write this kind of global guide. That was actually a task in our project, but we were going deeper into these practical matters, like the meaning of the museum label, which is absolutely crucial.
Yes. No, again, I don't think that I criticize your book. It is just a kind of, you know, thinking, and thinking could be sometimes difficult, you know, and obviously, you know, that suddenly the war in Ukraine appears, and suddenly we realize that actually Russia is missing, that Russia does not figure as a perpetrator in the book. You know, this is, I mean, I know why Russia doesn't exist, and that was also my as a perpetrator, because all those right-wing people in Eastern Europe who, you know, this kind of Russophobia, which actually prevents us from getting on Russia, because we don't want to liaise with the right-wing people. But suddenly there is such a strong example of Russian imperialism that we cannot miss it anymore.
If I may, just one short idea. As if I understand you, Katarzyna, correctly, your preoccupation was that the Ukrainian guidebook shouldn't be so theoretical and global, but more Ukraine-centered, Ukraine-focused, rooted in Ukrainian experience. And for me, this is a very good remark, very important remark. It should be centered, it should already tell Ukrainian story about coloniality and about Russian colonialism.
Yeah.
It is. I absolutely agree here. We can give examples that can be kind of resource for those Ukrainian museologists, museum people who will read it, who will use it as a basis, as a starting point for their work. But the story about Ukrainian cultural heritage and Ukrainian coloniality should be at least primarily told there. It should be presented there, because there is no such story yet, such a concise history. It should be written, and it can be a part of this book. Let it be just an outline, just a draft, you know, just because in time of war, I can understand that we cannot sit and do this book, especially those who work in Ukraine now in Ukrainian museums. They just do not have resource to sit and work and to focus on examples, histories, provenance, and of the collections and so on. But we can make like a draft, which will show which will serve a starting point, this history to be elaborated further. So that's my impression of how it could be.
A separate book. Stephanie, you wanted to ask a question, if I...
Oh, I've got many.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose I was interested because all the papers kind of took us through different theories and of decolonisation. And I wanted to ask Miroslava really quickly, just you mentioned at the start of your talk that you prefer the term de-imperialisation. And I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about that and why that's more helpful in your view.
Yes, and I'm glad you asked me that, because I've been thinking about why I resist the term decolonization. I see the concept of decolonization as, and I'm going to sound contradictory here, but nonetheless, it's more intuition than reason, maybe. Colonial attitudes are a give and take, I feel. It's a give and take. There's a kind of, whether it's positive or negative, but there is a kind of negotiation. You know, we're going to take over this, and you're going to give this, and we're going to kind of accommodate ourselves to this new reality, right? I don't think that happens in Ukrainian culture. I think it just is absorbed, stolen, possessed. And what's happening in the war today is evidence of it, you know, down to the stealing of a washing machine or a toilet. That's not colonization. That there's no negotiation there whatsoever. And so for me, I think this issue of extrication, you know, let's extract these, let's separate these two cultures. Let's show the world that Ukraine thinks this way, speaks this way, has a worldview like this, which is totally opposite to this. You know, let's not be big culture and subculture, but let's be equal cultures so that we can negotiate this understanding of each other and give understanding about us to the rest of the world. So for me, de-imperialization is really what it's about. I mean, really getting that imperial attitude out of everything, whether it's intellectual life, whether it's academic life. You know, there is no reason for an imperial attitude to exist when you look at Ukrainian art or culture or literature or anything. It shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be there. Granted, a lot of it is as a result of the imperial attitudes, but it has nonetheless survived despite it. And so, again, I never saw Ukraine as a colony of any kind. I saw it as a unique culture in and of itself. And I still can't bring myself to think of it in colonial terms. It's very personal.
It's really helpful. Thank you. I think it's worrying, isn't it? How, as you're saying, I think other speakers have said as well, that it's sort of the colonial mindset, as Tetyana said. I'm hoping it's changed now, but certainly when I was at school in the 1980s and 90s, we were taught that colonialism was a good thing. We were taught the British Empire was great and that we went around civilizing people. It's awful when you look back and you just think. I remember I was taught that Christopher Columbus was a great guy, and it's not till you're much older you realize just it's actually quite horrific, this history. And if you look back further to sort of old history books, it sort of gets even nastier. But these sort of discourses become sort of naturalized. And I think, as some speakers said right at the beginning, it's about being able to at least take a first step back from how we're constructing the world, whether it's in museums or in formal education or in books. It's interesting to think, I think, around the different ways in which that can be done, the different ways it can be conceptualized. I'm aware we're a little bit over time. Does anyone have any member of the audience as well? Do feel free to come in. Does anyone have any burning questions? We will of course be back again at the same time tomorrow if you'd like to ask them tomorrow as well.
I'd like to say thank you to all of the panelists. I learned a great deal, and it's really opened up my perspectives on the whole situation, and so many levels that from which we could address this issue that hold such promise. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Miroslava. I think that's a really nice note to end on. I also learned a huge amount. I've taken pages and pages of notes here. It's really, really interesting to think about. And I think you've set up this event really well through this really deep thinking about what it actually means to decolonize, and really sort of critiquing the term and thinking, is it the right term? And I think that sets us up really nicely for tomorrow, where we continue to talk more about practice. So thank you so much to all our speakers and all everyone that's been able to attend tonight. It's been absolutely brilliant, and I really look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you all tomorrow.
And it's good
Have
to
a good
have
night.
nice discussion, and look forward to continue.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.